principle of autonomy that can overrule other ones when they're in conflict doesn't exist. And then just briefly, if I looked at some of the courses students were taking, and not just in this European program, but elsewhere, they're courses like this: Ethics of Reproductive Technologies, where they learn highly detailed arguments about the moral status of a fetus and how it exists in IVF. Human genetics, learning about new personalized medicine and genetic treatments, all of which, when I talked to the students, said, this is not the ethical problem I'm going to face when I go back to the Philippines or when I go back to my own country. And here's a student saying that in confrontation with my culture, with religion, we want to preserve our culture. We want to preserve our purity. It's easy to destroy that, as the Spanish did in the Philippines. So there's this idea that something's being imposed. And here's a brief summary from a colleague of mine from India, where he says, look, if you look at the history of medical ethics, for example, the reference point is Hippocrates, as if no other medical ethics code existed. How many bioethicists know or even care to know about ancient India or China, and they had elaborate systems of medicine and medical ethics before Hippocrates? And you must be kidding if you discuss here, he's talking about in Europe, Buddha or Confucius or Shankara or even Gandhi for that matter. There's this one-size-fits-all of principles, and they want us to master the acrobatic art of balancing principles and beating off the worst kind of ethical malaise. So in sum, what do I see as the harms of wholesale adoption? Ethical ideas that are imposed rather than indigenous limit useful research by demanding that you have Western standards before research begins. They can disrupt existing moral traditions, creating confusion. And they give rise to cultural brokers who kind of try to stand between these Western ideas and local traditions into all sorts of negotiating in the attempt to gain status in their local communities. Now, very quickly, I want to talk about the other two ideas. I'm conscious of our time. There are people who say, okay, we'll take these Western ideas, but we'll make them fit in our own culture. And here's an example from Karachi University in Pakistan. If you look at their curriculum, which I've done, the topics are very Western: informed consent, conflict of interest, privacy, confidentiality, rights of patients. It's that right-based idea that comes out of our tradition. And they say in this article by Siddiqui, we're educating our students in the basics of bioethics, using practical examples to highlight ethical issues, but we're trying to keep the social milieu of Pakistan in mind. Another example comes out of the Middle East. This is a US-funded program, Middle East Research Ethics Training Initiative. And in their course, this is a very predominant piece they use, which really stood out to me: Islam and the Four Principles. And this author says Islam has given great importance to what are known today as the ethical principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. But you see here, what I see going on is that here what we're saying is Western ideas are supported by Islam, not that they're ethical ideas that we can get out of the Islamic tradition. But we're saying, hey, you have some cool ideas. Oh, we like those too. And we're never saying, what are your moral traditions and how might they teach us to develop ethical guidelines? And here's a student saying, my role was to have to translate Western ideas. So I have these ideas, and now somehow I have to make them fit in my home countries. You have to always make changes. The cultural, religious, whatever background that you have cannot apply directly to them. So here the idea is adopting Western ideas to fit in non-Western contexts. Now finally, my last point. I think there's another way to do this, and I have to say this is a theoretical rather than empirical model. That is, I haven't observed it too much out there being done. And this idea would use the knowledge of ethics. Hey, we have to admit we're people with moral traditions, and we bring those moral traditions to the ethical problems we face. But we don't say these moral traditions are the answer to your problems. We say, this is one way we've converted a moral idea to an ethical guideline. Now, let's think together about your moral tradition and how we might convert it to ethical guidelines. That's where the conversation happens. So the focus is on the process of articulating and applying moral ideas. And unlike existing ethics training, this is more inductive. Let's start with the tradition and see what emerges out of this. You start with thinking about local moral ideas. You use the history of moral philosophy as an example of how to implement moral ideas in practice. I think this model turns the existing model on its head, because basically what it says is, we're in a conversation here, and what might we learn from you about how we can do ethics? And what might you learn from us about how you can do ethics? So it's really an inductive, dialogic way of thinking about ethics. Ethics remains helpful. Here's my 2-minute warning. Oh, 5-minute warning. Oh, I'm going to slow down. I was rushing. No, that's great. I'm actually near an end. We'll have more time for questions, I think. So our ideas remain helpful, but not as maxims or things to be done, but as models of how we moved from moral traditions to ethical ideas. And there is one example, and those of you who don't know the work here, I think you'd be very interested to do a little more research. But in Pakistan, at this Sindh Institute for Urology and Transplantation, they have a Center for Biomedical Ethics. And they really are, I think, thinking in this way about how to do ethics in Pakistan. In their course, Foundations of Moral Thought, they focus on the historical contributions of Muslim philosophers to moral thought. And they basically have this idea that we're trying to engage in a constructive critique of secular philosophical bioethics. They look at indigenous values. This is a quote from their course book. They look at cultural and religious norms, socioeconomic realities, and how individuals actually arrive at decisions in relationships between professionals and persons. The leader of that center is Farhat Moazzam. Some of you might know her work, but this is what she says about the need for a local bioethics. It's necessary for us to evolve bioethics in a coherent way in this country, give it a form that resonates with our values. Otherwise, bioethics in Pakistan will remain an academic exercise irrelevant to the needs of our population. I think if this approach flourishes more in the developing world, it will generate an important dialogue about moral ideas. And I think, really, we're going to learn a lot about how we do ethics in this country as well. To me, that's almost as important as making sure we're not being imperialistic in other countries. So quickly, a summary, and then a few recommendations. One of the things I'm trying to get us to think about, it's very difficult to decide, and this was a theme of Howard's talk as well, about whose ethical standards should apply in collaborative research. And collaborative research is happening more and more. You also have the golden rule problem. I wouldn't be a good sociologist if I didn't point this out. And the golden rule is not what you think, but it's he who has the gold makes the rules. And what I've seen in international research is when you come from a country like the United States, you come from an institution like this one, you have a lot of power and authority automatically given to you when you go into a country that's poorer. Also, another point to think about is how cultural brokers manipulate the ethical process. So my recommendations, and this is interesting because Howard and I did not talk ahead of time, but we're coming to a very similar place. This dialogue has to be characterized by mutual respect. These guidelines should reflect local culture and traditions. You cannot assume that one is superior, so we're talking about humility here. I think it's useful to adopt an inductive approach so that you're learning how moral traditions get converted to ethical guidelines. And then finally, the importance of talk. If you reach a moral impasse in your collaborations, you have to talk through the values in question and arrive at a solution that everyone can honor. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. DeVries. Certainly fascinating to see the globalized consideration of ethical issues. Next, our speaker is Dr. Vischer, or Professor Vischer. He's a professor of law at University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, and is a senior fellow at the Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law and Public Policy. His scholarship focuses on intersection between law and religion, with a particular concern for the religious and moral dimensions of professional identity. He is the author of Conscience and the Common Good, Reclaiming the Space Between Person and State. And he has published more than 24 articles in academic journals. He also writes regularly for the magazine Commonweal and blogs at Mirror of Justice. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, where he was an editor of the Law Review. Professor Vischer today is discussing the idea of liberty of conscience. It's a key foundation, as he states, of our legal system. He does make a distinction in this particular book when you go into discussing the principles of autonomy and how it relates to the whole idea of liberty of conscience. And one phrase that you stated really truly summarizes your thesis in there is that although conscience is inescapably personal, it is also inescapably relational. akin to some of the discussion that's taking place by Muslim ethicists and bioethicists, such as Dr. Sajdina, who will be presenting to us today when he discusses communitarian ethic and rights over responsibility, responsibility over rights. Please welcome.
Thank you. I very much appreciate the invitation to be part of this important gathering. I think the invitation is especially gracious since I'm neither a Muslim or a bioethicist. I feel like an interloper here, but hopefully I can add at least a little bit of value. As he mentioned, my field is law and religion, and I certainly, we could have a month-long conference devoted to the interplay of law, religion, and healthcare. I'm not going to do that. I want to focus down on a more particular question that I think is the most pressing question given the direction I see the conference taking, and that is to what extent is the American legal system likely to accommodate the religious commitments of healthcare providers? I'm not going to talk, at this point at least, about the likelihood that the legal system can accommodate the religious commitments of patients. I think that's a much less problematic proposition given some of the premises of the legal system, but we can talk about that in the question and answer session if you'd like. There's another angle you could take, and that would be to ask, to what extent can the legal system embody the religious commitments of a particular faith tradition? I don't see that as a premise of this conference, so I don't think it's quite as pressing. I also think if that was the premise, it would face much dimmer prospects. And let me explain why for just a couple of minutes. That is the notion that rather than trying to create space within the legal system for providers to exercise their professional duties in keeping with their religious commitments, the religious commitments then become reflected directly in the overarching legal norm that governs all. Now, I'm not going to say that this has never been the case. If you look back, there's been significant overlap between healthcare law and the teachings of Christianity in this country. The past criminalization of abortion and contraception, for example, and current prohibitions against assisted suicide reflect Christian teaching, though defenders of these laws claim, correctly in my view, that these prohibitions are based on broadly accessible moral principles that don't rely on any divine revelation. The perception that they have religious roots undoubtedly contributed to their demise in the case of abortion and contraception bans, and to their recurrent constitutional challenge in the case of bans on assisted suicide. The U.S. Supreme Court has grown suspicious of laws that attempt to answer what it sees as fundamentally religious questions. So in Roe versus Wade, for example, Roe is the case that struck down bans on abortion. The Supreme Court observed, quote, "We need not resolve the difficult question of when life begins. When those trained in the respective disciplines of medicine, philosophy, and theology are unable to arrive at any consensus, the judiciary at this point in the development of man's knowledge is not in a position to speculate as to the answer." Note that the court was not asked to come up with an answer, but simply to permit the Texas legislature to reflect an answer in its own statute on the beginning of life. The weighty and religiously informed, but not defined, question of when life begins was deemed a no-fly zone by the Supreme Court. More broadly and more recently, the Supreme Court has taken a skeptical stance toward laws that limit privacy and personal liberty, especially when those bans are based on moral claims that are not tied to any cognizable harms to be avoided. So in Lawrence versus Texas, a case from a few years ago, the court struck down a state ban on same-sex sodomy. And that was not especially surprising. What was more noteworthy was the reasoning the court employed in striking down the ban. The court suggested that the state's assertion that the ban emanated from the moral convictions of the citizens was not even a rational basis for the law, much less a compelling basis for the law. The Lawrence quote quoted approvingly from an earlier abortion case for the notion that, quote, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." Okay, let me just say that again. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. I'm guessing we could have an entire symposium in exploring an Islamic response to that one sentence, but that's the operative premise for the Supreme Court in some of these cases. Now, Lawrence did not involve a question of healthcare and medical ethics,